Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the banner review for the upcoming Alhaitham and Kazuha banners. Let's start by talking about the 4 stars. We've got Xiangling, Heizou, and Yaoyao. That's actually kind of nice. I know that there's a lot of people that did not end up either picking Yaoyao in the Leah event, so her being on banner is always nice. That being said though, if you already have C0 Yaoyao, she really doesn't gain that much from Constellations. C1 gives dendro damage bonus to your characters that get healed by your radishes, and a little bit of stamina restoration. The first part is only really useful in like Alhaitham teams, but even then, there's not that many Alhaitham teams where you want to be playing Yaoyao, unless like you just don't have the other options. So it's really mostly the stamina restoration. It's fine. It doesn't really do that much. Alright, it's only up to once every 5 seconds. It's a nice little quality of life constellation that can do a few things, but overall it's very, very minor. C2 makes you regenerate more energy during your ult. It's like about 15 energy. It's nice to help your AR requirements, but Yaoyao's damage scalings are kind of meh, and her healing is so good that sacrificing healing stats to make sure that you have as much energy recharge as you can get is really not a particularly big sacrifice, because she just heals so much that she'll heal you to full anyways. And so a passive like this on her just doesn't do that much, because if you don't have to build as much energy recharge, then what can you build? A little bit more HP, but you're already healing enough. A bit more damage, but like realistically, you still won't be doing a lot of damage. So all in all, again, right, it's a nice little quality of life thing that doesn't do that much. So it's really far from necessary. You can kind of say the same thing about C3 and C5. They're also a tiny little bit more damage, but again, her damage isn't that great. And a bit more healing, but she already heals more than enough. C4, after using ER ult, she gains EM based on her max HP up to 120. This doesn't really do that much. It's fine on like quicken teams. It increases her damage a tiny bit. It's not completely useless, but it's also not that huge. And it's actually not that good in Nilo teams, because usually in your Nilo teams, when you're trying to min-max them as much as possible, you want your Hydro units to be the one to trigger your reactions, not your Dendro units, which means that Yaoyao's ownership of blooms in your Nilo teams, if things go right, should be incredibly low. So this just won't do that much. So all in all, again, it's another small little thing that can be helpful, but is far from necessary. And then C6, you gain slightly better Dendro application, a little bit more damage, a little bit more healing. This is the only constellation that actually does something, really, does something noticeable. But even then, it's not really noticeable enough to be that big of a deal. So this is really just an example of a character that is incredibly unreliant on constellations. So if you already have a C0 Yaoyao, her being on banner is really not all that useful for you, because again, right, her constellations just don't give you that much. But if you don't have her, she is an incredibly good unit, so getting her is actually very, very useful. Then you've got Heizou. Heizou, I think, is a character who gets a bad reputation because of how steep competition is for Animo units. And I think it's partly justified, because yeah, he is just worse in almost every situation than Sucrose and or Kazuha. But some people don't have Kazuha, maybe don't have enough Primogems to guarantee that they get the 5-star on this banner. And if that's the case for you, getting Heizou for one side, if you need an Animo unit in both of your teams, getting Heizou for one side and Sucrose on the other is better than getting Sucrose on one side and something like Animo MC on the other. The reason why Heizou's not that valuable is just because his competition is really strong. But in a vacuum, right, if you just want to play him because you think he looks cool or anything like that, he is actually a really good unit. He's got very consistent Animo application. He's got a little bit of grouping. It's not a lot of grouping, but it is a little bit. It's not completely useless. His normal attack animations actually feel very fluid. So all in all, he's just an okay unit. His constellations help increase his damage a pretty like sizable amount. But if you want to play him, you're generally better off playing him in something like Taser or Salad or Aggravate, where he's there to be like an on-field Animo driver more than a unit that's like Hyper Carry or anything like that. So most of the time, these constellations just won't be that big of an increase, because a lot of your team's DPS is coming from other units and not from him directly. If you just really, really want to see the big numbers that he can do with his E though, they can be pretty useful. All in all, he's a unit that's always nice to have lying around, but far from like a huge highlight. He's a pretty like okay whatever unit to have on a banner. It's not like Xinyan, but it's also not like Xingqiu. Somewhere in the middle. Moving on to the last 4-star on the banner, we have Xiangling. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you guys, but Xiangling's a pretty good unit. Specifically in this Abyss, Xiangling's a very good unit. This Abyss wants you to play Pyro, let's just say it like that, and rewards applying Pyro without needing to stay on the same character all the time. Because if you stay on the same character all the time, it's a lot more likely that you just die. Xiangling is just a very good unit overall, who is actually very favored in this Abyss, even more so than usual. And she actually has really good constellations, right? You get one for free, so unless you just literally have never touched Abyss before, this won't be your first Xiangling, but it would, if you get Xiangling from this banner, it will be a Xiangling constellation. Her C1 is fine. When you're in AoE, it's a bit unreliable because it's basically impossible to decide which enemy Guoba attacks. Technically, you can kind of, like, you can nudge him a little bit by walking into him, and you can try to bait enemies in ways where the closest enemy will be the one that you want to hit with Guoba, but this is not the most reliable power resistance shred. It is a nice little upside though. C2, honestly, is a joke and basically does not exist. C3 is good. Most of Xiangling's damage comes from her Pyronado, and 3 talent levels on your biggest source of damage generally is very good. People very often overlook the C5 and C5 or C3 of certain characters because they're so useless on some other characters. So you look at a character like Xiao, for example, unless you're going all the way to C6, getting talent levels on your E is an incredibly minor portion of your damage that's being upgraded. And getting talent levels on your ult, well, the way that your ult scales your damage is really, really bad compared to the way that your normal attack scales your damage. And so because of that, Xiao's C3 and C5 are really bad. Even on a character like Ella, who has a lot of her damage coming from her ult, her constellation that increases her ult talent level isn't even that insane because she does have almost half of her damage, it depends on your rotations obviously, but a fairly sizable portion of her damage coming from her normal attacks. With Xiangling, it's basically all of your damage coming from Pyronado, which makes the C3 just a very nice constellation to have. C4 is one of the best constellations in the game. Again, same idea, it increases your main source of damage, well, it increases the damage of your main source of damage by increasing its duration by 40%. Now, generally, that's not actually a 40% DPS increase because most of the time, debuffs on enemies won't last for the whole Pyronado duration when you have C4. So it's generally closer to a 30% DPS increase. Obviously, it's gonna depend on the team. Some teams can maintain debuffs on enemies for longer, but even then, 30 to 40% more DPS is very good. The difference between a C2 Xiangling and a C4 Xiangling is actually kind of massive. It's over 50% more damage basically that you're doing. And it's also more shield breaking because Pyronado lasting longer means that you're applying Pyro more often. So against Cryo Herald, this is a pretty big deal. And C5 and C6 kind of don't matter because C6 does not apply to Pyronado itself. So it's only useful if you're playing her as a support for an on-field Pyro unit. It's like fine if you're playing like Funa Rational. It's fine if you're playing Bennett Xiangling Double Hydro, but generally it's just not that big. Guoba talent levels are very minor in terms of her overall damage output. But all in all, Xiangling on banners, if you don't have her C4 yet, is always a nice upside because having Xiangling available, even if you don't want to play Xiangling most of the time, she is still one of the better shield breakers for Pyro. And so having her C4 will still be useful, even if you don't really intend on really like building her all that much and building your team around her. So all in all, Xiangling is much better than average to have on a banner. Heizou is kind of average. Yaoyao will depend between below average if you already have her because her constellations kind of suck, to much higher than average if you don't already have her because she's an incredibly good unit. And so I would say this is pretty solid 4-star lineup. Not the best we've ever had, but generally not something, unless you already have the C6s on all of these, not something that I would say should be all that disappointing for most people. Then we have the 5 stars. I'll be releasing obviously Kazuha Ask the Jeff and Alhaitham Ask the Jeff, but as a quick little summary, they're both very good units. In general, if I had to choose between one of the two, I'd probably go for Kazuha because supports generally tend to have more long-term relevance than carries do, even if Alhaitham isn't strictly a carry and does lend, and his playstyle lends itself pretty well to like quick swappy teams that don't really fit the traditional carry supports role. Even then, I mean, they're both very good units and supports generally can fit in more teams. So, and I mean, that's the case for Kazuha as well. Kazuha can fit in more teams than Alhaitham. So all in all, like between the two, I'd say Kazuha's generally the more valuable. But obviously, if you only want Animo on one of your teams, then Kazuha's not nearly as valuable because, well, depending on the team where you want that Animo, sometimes Sucrose is better. And even when Kazuha's better, he's not necessarily that big of an upgrade. At the end of the day, it really just depends on what teams you want to be playing, whether or not you actually want to have Kazuha on your account. He's a nice unit to have, but he's not necessary. That being said though, both of them are much better than average, so these are definitely very solid banners. I'd say that like if you're starting right now, if you're starting a new account right now, either a new account because you're bored or because you just started playing the game, these are pretty solid banners to have at the beginning because it can be pretty easy to build your teams around either of these two. And getting Xiangling Constellations early, as well as getting at least one single copy of Yaoyao, and then getting Heizou if you don't have Sucrose, or if you're going on the Alhaitham banner and you can have one Heizou and one Sucrose. But these are all things that make early accounts power kind of skyrocket a little bit. So all in all, these are very nice beginner banners. Now obviously, that doesn't mean you should necessarily go for them, as usual, right? The main thing that should decide whether or not you pull for a character is look at how many Primo Gems you have and ask yourself, if I go all the way to Hard Pity, lose the 50-50 to get this character, will I have enough Primo Gems remaining to guarantee the next character I want? Especially with Fontaine right around the corner, there's probably going to be a bunch of new characters, including an Archon. So if you don't need to pull for characters, if you don't care that much about Abyss, or if you already have your 36 stars in Abyss, it would be somewhat wise to hold off and see what kind of units we're going to get in Fontaine. But either way, that's kind of it for the character banners. Now let's look at the weapon banner. Freedom Sworn, I think, is one of the biggest bait weapons in the game. Not because it's bad on Kazuha, but because Kazuha's 4-star weapon options are too good. In other words, Favge. It's even on the banner, it's there to taunt you. Kazuha has ER requirements. A lot of teams rely on using his ult for setups, and even the ones that don't, well, you want to use his ult because it is most of his damage. And he should generally be doing a reasonable amount of damage, unless really you're playing him in like a mono Hydro team, where, for those of you who didn't know, Hydro Swirl does not do AoE damage. So it's the only element that if you're swirling, you'll only get one instance of swirl damage per enemy, rather than 2. It does apply Hydro in AoE, but it doesn't do damage in AoE. In any case, usually Kazuha does a pretty reasonable amount of personal damage, and that reasonable amount of personal damage relies on getting his ult. Now, when you want to get his ult, his ER requirements will actually vary a lot depending on what team you're using with him. A lot of teams can only slot one Kazuha E in the whole rotation because they have very strict or very punishing downsides when you swap to Kazuha. Like if you're playing Sino, swapping out of Sino means that his ult expires. So you don't want to do that in the middle of his ult. So there's a few teams where you can only get 1 E, a lot more teams where you'll be maxed out at 2 E's per rotation, but also a bunch of different characters generate different amounts of energy. All of this to say, there are teams where Kazuha's ER requirements can reach as high as 200 or even more energy recharge. When that's the case, while it is technically possible to get that from substats alone, it's very hard. Especially considering the fact that EM main stat is the rarest on both Goblet and Circlet. And then on top of that, it's a 1 out of 5 that an artifact that you get is a Goblet. If you're farming it through domains rather than Strongbox, it's also a 1 out of 2 that is the wrong set. Point being, it can be very, very, very difficult to reach 200 ER with only substats. So you're gonna have to use an ER Sans most of the time in those teams that have very high ER requirements. Now, when you do that, a weapon that gives about 200 EM, that's cool and all, but you're losing about 200 EM by having to go for an ER Sans rather than an EM Sans. Which means, if you were to go for an ER weapon instead, you could stick to an EM Sans. And because, as it turns out, the best weapon series in the game is ER weapons, right? Favge. If you get to choose between EM Sans Favonius or ER Sans, for now let's talk about just the 4-star, so Iron Sting or Umbrella or whatever. Well, you'll end up with about the same amount of EM and ER with both, but on one, you'll also have clear particle generation, and on the other, you'll have up to 24 or 32 with the Umbrella and single target damage percent, but most of his damage is swirl damage, which does not get increased by damage percent. In other words, one of those passives is not that good, and the other one is the best passive in the game. 3 clear particles is a lot, and because both his E and his ult are multi-hit abilities with pretty large AoEs, then it's a lot more likely that at least one of those hits on one of those targets hit will trigger a crit, which will trigger the Fav proc. And even then, you can also go for something like Sac, which gives you better grouping, and also more particles because you're getting 1 more E. All in all, when it comes to ER weapon versus EM weapon, generally the ER weapons are better. Now, obviously, Freedom Sword has an actual useful passive on top of that, but a lot of teams can't benefit a lot from the from the normal attack, charge attack, plunge attack, I think, damage bonus from Freedom Sword. So it's only 20% attack. And honestly, in most situations, I would argue that 3 clear particles, and if you get to use your E twice per rotation with a high refine of Fav, 6 clear particles can actually be a lot more valuable than that 20% attack. Especially in teams that don't generate that much energy, where those clear particles will actually make a huge difference in terms of how much energy recharge your characters need. All of this to say, while Freedom Sword can be a good option, especially when you're playing teams that have more flexibility in rotations, where you can use actually 3 E's per rotation. Right, like in those situations, Freedom Sword can actually be a pretty reasonably good option. But even then, it's not that big of an increase over Fav. All in all, I would really never recommend going for Freedom Sword specifically in order to increase your Kazuha, or to upgrade your Kazuha. So the question then becomes, is the other weapon good enough that this banner can be useful anyways? And the answer to that is maybe. LoFi, the light of the foliar incision, LoFi. LoFi is a very good weapon on Alhaitham, and a pretty solid option on a few other characters like EM Bennett or Kutsing. But on most characters, it is one of the weakest 5-star options, and something like Mist Splitter or Jade Cutter would very often just outperform it. Because if you can't take advantage of the EM passive, the amount of stats that it offers is generally just not enough to compete with the other 5-star options. So it's a little bit more limited. Now, obviously, if you have those characters on and you use them, right, the characters on which LoFi is good, then it can very much be a good weapon. I would argue if you already have another of the 5-star weapons, I wouldn't go for it because it's not that much of an upgrade. But if you don't, and you like Alhaitham, you want to get him a signature weapon, it's fine. And then if you were to lose the 50-50 and get Freedom Sworn is also actually a pretty reasonably decent option on Alhaitham. So even if you lose the 37.5% and you don't have the primos to go all the way, if you get Freedom Sworn, it's not the end of the world. Obviously, there's also the possibility that you just get an off-banner weapon, right? There's a 25% chance that you get an off-banner weapon, in which case it doesn't matter what weapon banner this is, that's always going to be the case. But yeah, all in all, I'd say that the 5-star options are about average. Freedom Sworn is, in my opinion, the slightly below average weapon, but being a support weapon, right, even if I wouldn't say that it's as big of an increase to team DPS as most other 5-star weapons are, it is going to be an increase in team DPS in more teams that you play, because you're going to be using it in more different teams, because you're going to be using your Kazuha in more different teams than you'd be using your Ganyu, for example. So it's still a fine weapon. And then LoFi, in terms of signature weapons, is a little bit below average, because while it is good on the signature characters, it's a bit weaker as a flex option on characters other than the signature character. But all in all, in terms of the grand scheme of all the weapons that there are, it's definitely above average when you start including shit like Skyward Blade. But yeah, this is pretty average in terms of 5 stars. And unironically, in terms of 4 stars, there's a few interesting things. So obviously, Favge Sword is the best sword that there can be on a banner by far. Like, it's not even close. Sac Sword can be pretty nice as well, and Xiphos can also be nice. I'm actually kind of surprised that they're not putting Xiphos on this banner, because it's basically the only 4-star weapon that can compete with Fav on Kazuha. And even then, by the way, I'm saying that, lower fine Xiphos is still often worse than Fav. But anyways, Fav is just a really good weapon. It's the best sword to have, it's the best sword on a banner, it's the most flexible one. You use it on almost every sword character, it's just nice. And having multiple of them is very useful, because there's a lot of good sword characters that want to use Fav. I mean, I made the mistake of refining my Fav. The last time I got a Fav sword was over 2 years ago, I think. So I've been stuck with only Fav sword, only one Fav sword at R3 for over 2 years. It's one of my biggest regrets, and I just really wish I had not done that. Anyways, Fav is always a good weapon to have on a banner, and Favge Sword is the best of the Fav weapons. Favge Codex is fine. It's a little bit worse because there's less, well, there's a bit more competition in terms of the good catalysts for support characters. You have TTDS, that's always a nice, solid option. You have Sac Frag when you're using it on Sucrose, that's also a very nice option. So Favge Codex is not quite as useful, but I do use Favge Codex on Nahida because I'm a very big fan of the Dendra teams that use 4 different elements, right? The culinary archetypes, curry, salads, bread, saute, oven. The thing is, when you're using characters of 4 different elements, none of them is helping each other in terms of generating energy all that much, because you gain more energy from particles that are generated of your element than of different elements. Clear particles help a lot with that. So Favge Codex, in my case, actually helps a lot in terms of my ER requirements when I play all of those different teams. It's the main reason why my Nahida is basically always on Favge Codex, and I would probably think a lot less of Nahida if I did not have a Favge Codex. So it's still fine to have, like, it's not bad, but it definitely is a lot less versatile than Favge Lance or Favge Sword. Mouuns Moon is kind of eh. Because it actually has good stats, but like, who's a bow user that deals most of their damage through their ult? I guess Ganyu in freeze teams, and it's pretty good on Ganyu in freeze teams. But also, Prototype Crescent is so f***ing broken. Have you seen the amount of stats that you get from Prototype Crescent? Hello? Have you seen that? 72% attack? Huh? It can also be fine on Yelan, but because it has attack, or it's balanced around having attack substat, then really you're not getting quite as much value out of it as an attack scaling character would. It can still be a solid option, but it's not really a sizable increase over anything else. And a lot of the time, Favge is better on Yelan. Obviously, yeah, like if the enemies don't have weak points, it can be better than Prototype Crescent on Ganyu. But my point being that there's just not really that many good options for characters to use Mouuns Moon. So it's overall a pretty below average weapon. Then we've got Wavebreakers Fin, which is probably one of the most tragic weapons in the game. Because you look at what it does, you look at it at the stat line, you look at the effect, and you're like, wow, this is so good. 620 base attack ascension, or attack substat, burst damage based on total energy cost in your party. It would sure be a shame if there was another polearm that gave burst damage that just gave more stats, right? Oh golly gosh darn it, there is! The biggest problem with Wavebreakers Fin is that on most characters that could use it, it doesn't start being better than the catch until you have like R3, R4, R5. And below that, it's worse than the catch. And even above that, it's not significantly better. It is a good weapon, but the catch is too good. If you're using more than one character that would want to use the catch, then it's fine. If you're too lazy to fish, then it's fine. But all in all, it's a very tragic weapon because it's very good, but it's just outclassed by a free-to-play weapon. So it's like, yeah. And then Sac Greatsword, well, let's be real, Claymore characters suck anyways. It doesn't matter what the Claymore is on any banner. None of them really matters. Akumaru's kind of nice, I guess, and Favge is kind of nice as well, because Akumaru's good on Beidou and Favge is good on Razor if you're playing Thundering Fury, but really the Claymore slot is generally the least relevant to weapon banners because there's just not that many good Claymore users. Within the Claymore users, Sac Greatsword is whatever. All in all, I'd say in terms of like power, pretty significantly above average 4 stars, but in terms of value, it's actually kind of average because both Mouuns Moon and Wavebreakers Fin kind of have a few issues that are not really related to how much stats they give, but rather related to external factors. In Mouuns Moon's case, the lack of characters that really care for what it gives, and in Wavebreakers' case, the existence of the catch. All in all, this is a fine weapon banner. It's nothing crazy, it's not terrible. Probably more of a skip than a pull in general. About average, but do you really want to be pulling on something that's about average? It's up to you. If you really want the weapon, if you really like Alhaitham, do what you want, but definitely not the best one. And I don't remember if I gave like an overall rating of this. These two banners are above average, and yeah, they're pretty nice. Though, again, don't spend any money you can afford. Don't spend money on this shit game, true, real. Make sure you're not putting yourself in a situation where you're out of primo gems for a character that you want, and then your only option is to spend, because, well, you're a lot more likely to spend in a situation like that than if you have all the primo gems you want. In any case, that's gonna do it for the banner review. Let me know what you think of the banners in the comments. Let me know if you're gonna be pulling, and honestly, why? Because I am kind of curious. Basically, like, how many people are gonna be pulling because they want Alhaitham or Kazuha? How many people are gonna be pulling because they want Constellations? Oh, one thing I forgot. 5-star Constellations. Do not pull for Alhaitham Constellations. They are bad. If you want to know more about my thoughts on his constellations, go watch the Ask Jeff Alhaitham. But they are not very good 5-star constellations. I would not recommend going for them. And if you want to increase the strength of your Alhaitham teams, there are better ways to use your primo gems than going on constellations on him. Kazuha Constellations, his C1 is fine quality of life, but I think that most of the teams, it doesn't do that much because obviously one more E, right? Because that's what it lets you do. It makes you use your E after you use ult. It can be good for grouping, but all in all, it's kind of sus because it's more field time on him, and sometimes it's actually a DPS loss to use it. Not always. It can be useful, and it obviously helps with his ER requirements, but it's not all that insane. C2 is pretty good. It's just 200 EM for the whole team, including himself, so it increases personal damage. It's alright. It's a nice constellation. Again, it's a support constellation, so it not doing as much for your team's DPS as like a Hyper's constellation, like right in C2. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily worse, right? Because you can use it in more different teams. It's a fine answer. Like it's okay. When you're playing him in teams that don't care that much about the EM buff, or in teams where like the only use of the EM buff is increasing his damage and his buff, it's actually not very good. It's kind of shit. When you're playing him in teams that do care about the EM buff, like Aggravate or Vape, it is actually pretty useful though. All in all, that's fine. C3, not very good. Most of his damage comes from his swirls, not from his talent damage, so both C3 and C5 are kind of meh. And between the two, C5 is better because, well, C3 doesn't actually increase the damage of your E. It only increases the damage of your E cast, not of your plunge attack. So that's only half of the damage that your E does that's getting increased. It's even worse than you might initially think. And then his C4, a little bit more energy. That's nice. And C6 gives him Animo Infusion and increases his damage. It changes his artifact main stat and substat priority, but it's a pain in the ass to calc, and honestly, it's not worth going all the way there unless you just really want to get a C6 Kazuha to be able to say that you have a C6 Kazuha. But yeah, overall, C1 and C2 can be fine. There are some teams where C2 is actually pretty significant. Anything past that, I'd say, is kind of a waste of your primos unless you're an Omega Whale or you just like him a lot and want to get him to C6. But yeah, so that's gonna do it for the banner review. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think of the banners in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.